Questions orales, oral questions. The Honourable Opposition House Leader.
The Foreign Affairs Minister gave a major speech on Canada's foreign policy, but she failed to mention Canada's foreign policy with respect to China. Now we know why. The Minister of Industry was quietly approving a Chinese takeover deal of Vancouver-based Norsat International, a company who builds satellite receivers for NATO. Mr. Speaker, why is the Prime Minister so eager to sell our military technology to Beijing?
Honourable Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, we take the protection of national security very, very seriously. We never have and never will compromise on national security. All investments reviewed under the Investment Canada Act are screened by Canada's national security agencies, and the national security community conducted a rigorous review and confirmed that security procedures and safeguards are in place that are keeping with our high standards, Mr. Speaker. We always have and always will protect our national security.
Opposition House Leader.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it gets worse. Normally, any deal involving this type of satellite technology would be subject to a formal national security review. But in a very troubling development, the Industry Minister decided that a national security review wasn't necessary for this Chinese takeover. Mr. Speaker, Canadian national security interests are at stake here. Why did the Prime Minister allow this sale to China to go ahead without the comprehensive security review that it needed?
Honourable Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, the process was followed under the Investment Canada Act. And as I've stated before, we never have and never will compromise our national security. And when it comes to our economic agenda and our overall Investment Canada Act regime, we're being very clear that in order to grow the economy and create jobs, we must be open to investments. We must be open to trade. We must be open to people. This is good for Canada. This is good for our economy, Mr. Speaker. We will always defend the middle class and those working hard to join it.
Honourable Opposition House Leader.
This is shocking, Mr. Speaker. Hytera Communications has previously been accused of large-scale theft of intellectual property, and the UK has raised major red flags when Hytera tried to acquire a similar British company. Richard Fadden, the former head of CSIS, said that he would have recommended a full-fledged national security review of this deal. Why is the Prime Minister allowing his fascination with China and his overwhelming desire to appease them to cloud his judgment on the national security of our country?
The Honourable Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, under the Investment Canada Act, all transactions are subject to a national security review. So we followed the process. It was a rigorous process. And let's be clear, Mr. Speaker, we've been very clear when it comes to the economy, when it comes to growth in jobs, we're open to investment, trade, and people. We always have and always will make sure that we never, ever compromise our national security.
The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, I don't think the government realizes what a gaffe, what a blunder they're committing. This morning we learned that the Liberal government is allowing a Chinese investors to buy a Vancouver high-tech firm without a thorough national security review. The process was not properly followed. Is this the Prime Minister's way of thanking the Chinese billionaires who paid top dollar to meet with him privately? Mr. Speaker, I don't agree with my friend and colleague.
Was followed under the Investment Canada Act. We've always followed the law. We've made sure that we listen to our national security agencies and the experts and the advice they give us. Based on that advice and the feedback, we make decisions accordingly. We never have and never will compromise on national security, and we've also been very clear that we're open to investments in order to make sure we grow our economy and create good quality jobs for the middle class.
The Honourable Member for Louis Saint Laurent. Mr. Speaker, the company in question doesn't make shoes. They make high technology products that are used by the U.S. Defense Department and NATO countries. It's very precious, sensitive technology, and it hasn't been properly reviewed. Why has the government fallen down on its task? The Honourable Minister.
I want to take this opportunity to correct the record because the member opposite is saying that this particular transaction was not subject to a national security review. That is not the case. All transactions under the Investment Canada Act are subject to a national security review. We have followed the process, Mr. Speaker. We've done our due diligence. We've consulted the national security agencies, and we will make sure that we never have and never will compromise our national security. And at the same time, we're committed to growing our economy by making sure that we're open to investment, trade, and people, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Outremont.
Speaker, this is an important issue for all Canadians and for our security, and I know the Minister, and I know him to be an honourable gentleman. So I want to give him a chance to correct something that he's just said. In his first answer, he was particularly prudent. In his first of 5 answers, he talked about a screening. But he knows, and we all know, that a screening is not a national security review. Then he said procedures were followed. That can mean anything and nothing. Then at the very end, he started saying there was indeed a national security review which has a definition. I'd like him to clarify that. Was there or was there not a full national security?
The Honourable Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, under the Investment Canada Act, all transactions are subject to a national security review and making sure that the process was followed. So under this particular transaction, and as I said, all transactions, we followed the law. We made sure we did our homework, we did our due diligence, and any feedback that we receive from the national security agencies is taken seriously and taken into account before we make a decision. We always have and always will make sure that we never ever compromise our national security.
For Outremont.
I suppose it wouldn't bother the minister to make the opinions, the national security opinions, public. In March, the government reversed a decision by Stephen Harper, thereby allowing a Chinese takeover of a high-tech firm. Not even 3 months later, he's doing it again. He's waiving a national security review for this latest takeover, even though Canada uses this firm's technology for our security and defense. My question for the Liberals is, why are you selling our defense secrets to China? I'd like to remind the member for Outremont to direct his questions and comments to the chair. The Honourable Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the specific case raised by the member opposite, again, was with regards to ONET. And let's be clear, we did not overturn a cabinet order. The previous government managed the process so poorly that it ended up in court. We made sure we did a rigorous process. We examined all the facts by our national security agencies, and the law was followed, Mr. Speaker. The law was followed. We always have and always will make sure that we never, ever compromise our national security.
Member for Outremont. Order.
Asked yesterday about the UN nuclear disarmament negotiations that include over 120 countries, the Prime Minister said, quote, "You can have all sorts of people talking about nuclear disarmament, but if they don't actually have nuclear arms, it's sort of useless," unquote. The 1997 Ottawa Treaty on Landmines was initiated by Canada under a Liberal government and signed by over 100 countries that did not use landmines. Can the government now explain how that treaty was also, quote, useless?
Honourable comment is Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, when it comes to nuclear disarmament, our goal has been very clear. We're taking great steps to achieve it, Mr. Speaker. That means doing hard work to deliver something tangible. As mentioned by the Prime Minister yesterday, in 2016, for the first time ever, Canada rallied 159 states to support a resolution calling for the Fissile Material Cutoff Treaty. This is a concrete step towards a phasing out of nuclear weapons, and crucially including both nuclear and non-nuclear countries, Mr. Speaker. This is real action that matters to Canadians.
Member for Outremont.
And in 2016, in August, in fact, the Liberals voted for the first time in our history against nuclear disarmament, Mr. Speaker. In the words of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, political leaders will decide whether or not a nuclear war will actually take place, yet politicians act as if peace is too complicated for them.
These words are so meaningful at a time when Liberals and Conservatives are alike are attacking the NDP's motion on nuclear disarmament. Don't the Liberals realize that the words of the current Prime Minister are a direct insult to the over 120 countries doing this work? The Honourable Minister.
Speaker, let me be clear. We strongly support efforts towards nuclear disarmament. But what the member opposite is proposing is a negotiation of a nuclear weapons ban treaty without the participation of states that possesses nuclear weapons. This is posturing, Mr. Speaker, not practical diplomacy that can make a real difference. Our position is consistent with our allies. This is Germany and Norway, just to name a few. We're driving real action by working with nuclear and non-nuclear countries to achieve our ultimate goal, which is nuclear disarmament.
The Honourable Member for South Surrey White.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Minister has stated that the Infrastructure Bank will shield taxpayers from risk. But let's be clear. Taxpayers are funding the bank. Taxpayers will be paying the profits to the private investors through user fees and tolls. And the Minister is guaranteeing loans using taxpayer dollars. All of this additional risk is on the backs of taxpayers. Will the Minister just admit that the only people being shielded from risk are the private investors?
Minister of Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, as I often stated in this House, that the bank is actually designed to shift risk to the private sector, appropriate to the investment the private sector will make any given projects. We will make sure that the experts who will be running this bank will ensure that public interest is always protected, that public dollars are always protected. Our goal is to make sure that we are building the infrastructure that our communities need to grow our economy and create jobs for the middle class. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for South Surrey White.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. P3 Canada has been leveraging private sector dollars for infrastructure since 2009. $6 billion has been leveraged from an initial investment of $1.3 billion. A $35 billion investment into P3 Canada would leverage $170 billion. All without guaranteeing private sector loans with taxpayer dollars. An internal report from KPMG recommended using P3 Canada's existing structure for the bank. Will the Minister reverse this decision for the bank and invest in P3 Canada?
Mr. Speaker, P3s will continue to play a dominant role in building infrastructure, and we support that. And we allow municipalities to make that decision. We don't impose a certain procurement model on our partners. It is their decision. As well as the PPP Canada organization has supported the creation of the Canada Infrastructure Bank because they see that both complement each other to build the infrastructure that is required by Canadian communities.
The Honourable Member for Richmond Athabasca. Mr. Speaker, guess what these people have in common? The former PBO, the former BDC president, the Quebec National Assembly, KPMG's internal report, and all opposition members. All have been highly critical of the Infrastructure Bank. Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister finally and the Infrastructure Minister finally make the right decision and take the bank out of C44? The Honourable Minister of Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, very reputable Canadian pension funds such as Canada Pension Plan Investment Board, teachers, Amers, Caisse de Dépôt, Alberta Investment Management Corporation, they invest in international infrastructure. They invest in infrastructure in other countries. What we want to do is create conditions that our own pension funds who manage money on behalf of Canadians actually invest in our own country to build the infrastructure and create jobs for the Canadian people. What is wrong with that, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Member for Richmond Athabasca. Mr. Speaker, the government's stubbornness on this file is a sad sight. Heedless of all warning signs, the Liberals are heading straight into a wall. And who's going to pay for this $35 billion error in judgment? The taxpayer, directly. Does this Prime Minister listen to what we're saying on this side of the House, or is it going to be up to the Senate to bring the government back into line once again? The Honourable Minister of Infrastructure.
Mr. Speaker, during the process to create the Canada Infrastructure Bank, we consulted extensively with municipalities, with the provinces, with the stakeholders, with investors. And we all understand that in order to mobilize private capital, in order to build the infrastructure, we need to create a right governance structure, which is arm's length, a Crown Corporation, but at the same time accountable to this government, through the Parliament, to the people of Canada, because we want to undertake projects that serve public interest and bring the public good. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Carleton.
The member says that the Infrastructure Bank will be arm's length, but that arm will be long enough to reach into the pockets of taxpayers. In fact, long enough to reach into their pockets for projects that are already financed by the private sector. Former Liberal Minister Soji Markey, now lobbying for power companies, wants loan guarantees from taxpayers to build projects that are already built by the private sector. Will the government admit that this is not about increasing private involvement, but rather putting private profit on the backs of public risk?
The Minister of Infrastructure.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we have put forward a very ambitious, bold plan to build Canadian community infrastructure, tripling the investment compared to the previous government's meager commitment to building infrastructure. We understand that if you mobilize private capital, we can undertake projects that will never get built. That is the vision that we have, and that's exactly what we want to do by mobilizing our pension funds to invest in our own country.
Honourable Member for Carleton.
Last year, an employee for Shared Services Canada received an access to information request for all documents containing the word Liberal Party. The employee released 12 documents and deleted 398. It is an offence under Section 67 of the Access to Information Act to destroy documents that have been requested under the Act. The matter has been referred to the Attorney General. I wonder if the Attorney General will recuse herself, given that it is a Liberal Party matter, and let the Director of Public Prosecutions decide whether to prosecute the matter.
Secretary to the Minister of Public Services and Procurement.
Mr. Speaker, our government expects our employees to meet the highest level of ethical behaviour and decision-making. Shared Services Canada took this situation very seriously and immediately launched an investigation of the situation and notified the Information Commissioner. And of course, as is normal, this matter has been referred to the Attorney General of Canada. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Drummond. Mr. Speaker, after the fiasco of Madeleine Meilleur's appointment, I hope the government has learned that it can't use the selection process for officers of Parliament to make partisan appointments. The Official Language Commissioner plays a vital role in ensuring respect for both official languages and enforcing the Act. And the Commissioner works for Parliament, not for the Prime Minister. Will the government commit today to respect the process set out in the Official Languages Act and consult genuine consultations with the opposition leaders? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We promised Canadians a new, in-depth, merit-based, open process, and that's exactly what we did. Ms. Meilleur's skills were recognized at every step of the way. Her career was built on defending the interests of official languages communities and leadership in that area. More information will be made available in the days to come.
Mr. Speaker, after all the repetitious nonsense, can the Liberals now acknowledge that appointing a partisan commissioner without real consultation will result in unnecessary scandal and is a waste of Parliament's time? After the embarrassing withdrawal of Madame Meilleur's nomination, will the Liberals work with us to make sure this never happens again? And will the Liberals do the right thing and commit today to a new process that ensures meaningful consultation before any officer of the House is nominated? Yes or no?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Canadian Heritage.
Mr. Speaker, our government promised Canadians a rigorous, open and merit-based process for public appointments, and we are keeping that commitment. At no point in this process were Madame Mayor's qualifications questioned. She's been a fierce advocate of the official languages communities. We hope that she continues her advocacy on this important file, and more information will be available in the days to come.
Honourable member for Barrie Innisfil.
And how'd that work out for you? The Liberals tried to put a Liberal donor in a partisan in a position that would have allowed them to have any real oversight. The process was a train wreck, and responsibility for it lies directly with the Prime Minister, Gerald Butts, Katie Telford, and the Heritage Minister. You can bet that had this appointment occurred, the dominoes would have fallen quickly to fill the other vacant non-partisan positions with Liberal insiders. Can the Prime Minister tell us if his backroom political operatives are making new deals to fill the vacant parliamentary officer positions?
Government House Leader.
Sir, as I have shared with all members and as well as Canadians, that we have put into place a new open, transparent, merit-based appointment process where we actually look at gender parity. We look at Canada's 2 official languages. We are looking for highly qualified candidates. Any positions that are available online so that Canadians can apply. This is a new promise, new process that we committed to Canadians. We will continue to deliver on our commitments. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Barrie Innisfil.
Well, during the election, the Prime Minister promised oversight watchdogs would be accountable only to Parliament, not the government of the day. Like many things this Prime Minister has promised, those promises are proving worthless. Playing political games with these appointments call into question the legitimacy of Liberal motives. For example, the Ethics Commissioner term is up in 30 days, and there's no word on her replacement. Now, that makes one wonder whether the Prime Minister wants the investigation into his questionable ethics to go away with Mrs. Dawson's retirement. Mr. Speaker, can the Liberals give us a reason why they haven't moved to fill this position? Good question.
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, we will always appreciate the work that officers of Parliament do, and that's why we have committed to always working with them. Any information that is required in regards to the cases, we will be more than willing to provide. The Prime Minister has said that. I have said that. When it comes to the appointment process, we have introduced a new open, transparent, merit-based appointment process, and I encourage all Canadians to apply for open positions that are all posted online. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Lévis-Lotbinière. Mr. Speaker, after the botched appointment process for the position of Official Languages Commissioner, Canadians have the right to know what will be the criteria for the appointments of future officers of Parliament. Mr. Speaker, will Canadians get the non-partisan process they legitimately expect, or will being a Liberal Party donor be the one and only criterion in the appointment process for the next Ethics Commissioner? The Honourable Government House Leader. Mr. Speaker, we have set up a new appointment process which is open, transparent, and merit-based. Our goal is to identify highly qualified candidates that respect the principle of gender parity and reflect Canadian diversity. Canadians can continue to apply for these positions. The application forms are available online. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Give the Minister of Innovation one more chance on this one, because I'm very troubled by how there are 2 answers being given in the House today. Despite the fact that Norsat actually sells technology to Nav Canada, which is in charge of our air traffic, the Minister said to the Globe and Mail that it was decided in the security screening analysis that an in-depth security review by CSIS and the Department of National Defence was not necessary. So will he tell us once and for all in this House, is he relying upon a flimsy screening analysis, and why did he not allow for a full in-depth review?
Honourable Minister of Innovation.
Mr. Speaker, I'm relying on the same process that was followed by the previous government and by that member. We will always follow the law under the Investment Canada Act. The process is very clear. All transactions are subject to a national security review. We made sure we followed the process, we did do our due diligence, we did our homework, and we heard very loud and clear from the feedback given by our national security agencies before we make any decision. We have never, and we never will, compromise on our national security.
Honourable Member for Port Moody Coquitlam. Order.
Today is World Oceans Day, a day to acknowledge our important relationship with our oceans. In BC, understanding salmon is a direct link to understanding our oceans. But just 2 weeks ago, the government announced it will end the popular Salmon in the Classroom education program. Mr. Speaker, over 1 million students have gone through this powerful program since it began. For the sake of our oceans and our salmon, will the minister reverse this terrible decision to cut the Salmon in the Classroom education program?
Minister of Fisheries.
Mr. Speaker, I'm glad on World Oceans Day to thank my colleague for the question, to tell members of the House that I had the privilege earlier today of announcing the creation of Canada's newest marine protected area, St. Anne's Bank, Mr. Speaker, off the east coast of Cape Breton in your province of Nova Scotia. With respect to the question about salmonid enhancement, this is a very valuable program. This is a program, I share the member's view, that has done a great deal to protect the iconic species of Pacific salmon. And Mr. Speaker, we will always be there to support the important work done by those volunteers and others who've done such a great job.
Honourable Member from Nanaimo, Ladysmith.
This year, World Oceans Day is focused on stopping marine debris. But Liberal and Conservative governments have failed to clean up abandoned vessels littering our coasts. These vessels are a major source of oil spill and pollution, and they threaten jobs in aquaculture, commercial fishing and tourism. Yet the recent Liberal announcement is a drop in the bucket. Of the thousands of abandoned vessels littering Canada's 3 coasts, exactly how many will $1 million clean up each year? Can the minister give us a number?
The Minister of Transport.
Speaker, we're extremely proud of the fact that we announced the Oceans Protection Plan last November, an unprecedented $1.5 billion plan to improve marine safety, and a component of that is cleaning up abandoned derelict vessels. Recently, I announced an abandoned vessels program for small vessels. I want to assure my colleague this is only the beginning. This is an ongoing program, and there will be more to come in the months ahead. Thank you.
Honourable Member for Central Nova.
Mr. Speaker, this House unanimously passed a motion from my colleague, the member for Fundy Royal, to study Atlantic immigration and the retention of newcomers. For 10 years, the Harper Conservatives ignored and insulted Atlantic Canada, and after yesterday, it looks like the NDP have sided with the Conservatives. On this side of the House, all 183 of us proudly support Atlantic Canada and our colleague from Fundy Royal. Can the Minister of Immigration please update this House on what our government is doing to support prosperity and economic growth in my region of Atlantic Canada?
Great question. Minister of Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my 32 colleagues from Atlantic Canada for their strong leadership and advocacy. L'immigration est un moteur de la croissance.
Our process is based on economic growth.
Pilot program as part of the Atlantic Growth Strategy. This program will attract and retain skilled newcomers and through an innovative partnership with employers, provincial governments and settlement agencies. Mr. Speaker, regardless of whether you're from Toronto, Vancouver or Calgary, the success and vitality of Atlantic Canada is essential for all Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Selkirk, Interlake, Eastman.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Defence Minister presented Canadians a book of empty promises. In 2 years, the Liberals have failed to deliver a single piece of military equipment, and they don't plan on buying anything for our troops until after the next election. Now, the Prime Minister already believes that our troops are appropriately provisioned. The Defence Minister can't explain where the money is going to come from, and when the Defence Minister was asked about this yesterday, he said, well, go ask the Defence Minister. So I will. Where is the money going to come from?
Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, allow me first of all to congratulate the Minister for having led the biggest defence consultation in 20 years and for having passionately defended his new defence policy. In the years to come, thanks to this policy, a major change is coming. The Canadian Armed Forces will be fully funded. Over 70% The budget will go up by over 70% in the coming 10 years. An extra many billions of dollars. The Honourable Member for Charlebourg-Saint-Charles. And I'd like to thank the Minister for accepting the majority of the recommendations from the Conservatives in his new defence policy. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, there's a little problem when it comes to the Liberals' accounting architecture. On page 11 of the policy, they tell us that the costing is transparent and indeed that it's fully costed. Well, somebody should tell the Minister of Finance, because yesterday he didn't know that. Can the Minister of Finance or Defence please confirm to this House that the defence budget is indeed confirmed and tell us exactly where the money's going to come from? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, our defence policy has been rigorously costed. It's realistic and affordable. The costing was supported by external experts, and our methodology was studied by 5 external accounting firms. The necessary funding to support this policy has been budgeted and will come from the financial framework.
Peace River, Northern Rockies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Liberals' dithering on the softwood lumber file just keeps getting worse. We learned this week that Obama's visit, expected to result in the signing of the softwood lumber agreement, cost Canadians $4.8 million, with nothing to show for it, while hundreds of thousands of good-paying Canadian jobs are being lost and at risk. And now we find out that lumber remanufacturers are paying twice as much as regular mills. Why is the Prime Minister refusing to protect the softwood lumber industry, specifically our remanufacturers?
Parliamentary Secretary for Natural Resources.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canada's forest industry sustains hundreds of thousands of good-paying jobs across our country. Our government will continue to fight vigorously to defend the interests of Canadian workers and companies in the face of actions taken by the U.S. that are completely without merit. We are taking decisive and immediate action to help Canadians who are affected by these unfair and punitive damages. We are making investments to diversify forest products and markets for our producers, supporting workers, and providing financial products and services on commercial terms. We stand firmly behind the Canadian forest industry and are supporting their long-term health and prosperity. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Portneuf-Jacques-Cartier. Mr. Speaker, on the softwood lumber file, we don't want just any agreement. As they say, we want an agreement that works for our industry. So why, as soon as the American surcharge was announced, was the government of Quebec able to announce the same day to an aid program to support industry? Yet it took Ottawa 6 weeks to cough up a federal aid program. Beyond that, Mr. Speaker, this government has had 20 months to negotiate an agreement, and they can't bring home the bacon. How can thousands of Canadian workers trust this Liberal government? 20 months, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs. Mr. Speaker, the Conservative government let this agreement expire. The duties imposed by the American Commerce Agreement are punitive and unfair. We will go before the tribunal and we will win, as we have done every single time this has happened. The Prime Minister spoke with the President at the G7 summit and on a number of other occasions, and we want a good agreement, not just any agreement. It will take some time, but we will win. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Courtney Alberni.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday I asked the Prime Minister if he would support the marine debris cleanup currently underway on Vancouver Island. He responded that the Oceans Protection Plan would help protect our coast. Nice words, Mr. Speaker, but that's all they are. There is no mention of marine debris in the government's Ocean Protection Plan and no money for cleaning it up. As we see more and more cargo traffic off our coast and the level of plastic in the oceans continue to rise, why do the Liberals have no plan to clean up marine debris?
The Honourable Minister of Transport.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very proud of the fact that our Oceans Protection Plan goes way beyond anything that has ever been done in this country. I recognize that the issue that has been brought up by the member is an issue that is occurring more and more, and it's certainly something that we can look at, but I'm very proud of the fact that we have taken an unprecedented commitment to marine safety on the 3 coasts of our country. This is a new first for Canada. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Berthier-Maskinongé. Mr. Speaker, less than a month before CETA comes into force, we still don't know anything at all about the administration of the Liberal Transition Plan or the tariff quotas. They promised to fully compensate the dairy sector for losses caused by CETA, but the announced sums are far from doing that, Mr. Speaker. So much so that the government of Quebec says it's ready to delay implementation of CETA because there isn't any real conversation for dairy producers. When will the government act, stand up, and compensate the dairy sector for the losses under CETA?
Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Colleagues' question and concern, and our government fully supports the supply management system and will continue to support the supply management system. We have consulted the dairy farmers and the processors across this country for a number of months and come up with a program of $350 million, $250 million so that our dairy farmers can innovate, $100 million so our processors can innovate and be on the cutting edge, Mr. Speaker. So this government has and will continue to make sure that our supply management system continues to thrive in this country.
Honourable Member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Speaker, for the past week, the Liberals have refused to answer straightforward questions about whether they plan to cancel a publicly accessible registry for high-risk sex offenders. What do the Liberals have to hide? Should Canadians take the Liberals' non-answer as a yes, that indeed they plan to cancel this tool for parents to keep their kids safe from high-risk sex offenders, yes or no?
The Honourable Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, public safety and the safety of children are always a priority, and I'm sure that is true for all members of this House. The National Sex Offender Registry was created and funded in 2004 by former Public Safety Minister Anne McClellan. It is a tool, a very effective tool, for ensuring that high-risk offenders are identified. When a potentially dangerous offender is about to be released, the Correctional Service alerts the police. If there is a danger, the police alert the public. Police and communities working constructively together, that is how best to make sure our children.
The Honourable Member for Bellechasse, Chemin-Lévis. When it comes to marijuana, the Prime Minister said yesterday, and I quote, "Until the law is changed, the law remains the law." Meanwhile, the implementation of a public registry of sexual predators is the law. So does the Public Safety Minister share his Prime Minister's opinion? If so, when will he apply the law and implement the new register? If it's a question of money, well, what's the problem? We have a $30 billion deficit, and it's going to cost peanuts to protect our children.
Mr. Speaker, the law is the National Sex Offender Registry, created in 2004 by Minister McClellan, and it works very effectively. In 2015, the Harper government passed legislation to create another database, but it was never actually set up, and it was never funded by the previous government.
The Honourable Member for Langley-Aldergrove. Order.
There they go again, Mr. Speaker, protecting the criminal. Mr. Speaker, when the Prime Minister introduced his mandatory Ottawa knows best carbon tax, he promised Canadians it would be federally revenue neutral. Well, that's not true. Research from the Library of Parliament clearly shows that the Prime Minister will take millions out of Alberta and British Columbia by charging GST on the carbon tax. Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister stop increasing taxes on Canadians, start to keep his promises, and immediately eliminate this unfair tax on a tax?
The Honourable Minister of Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was very proud the other day when all members of Parliament but one voted in favour of the Paris Agreement. We are showing that Canada is committed to serious climate action. We understand that as part of any serious plan, we need to have a price on pollution. So I would ask the party opposite, do they support putting a price on pollution, fostering the innovation we need to create good jobs and grow our economy?
Hear, hear. Order. Member for Charleswood, St. James, Assiniboia, Headingley.
Mr. Speaker, this month, young Canadians in my riding of Charleswood, St. James, Assiniboia, Headingley, and across the country will be graduating from high school and getting ready to start the next phase of their education. Demand for skilled tradespeople is growing in our country, and a job in the skilled trades is a promising career. Could the Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Labour please update this House on actions our government has taken to help youth enter the skilled trades?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. And in fact, our government recognizes that an education in the skilled trades leads to good-paying jobs in our country. Earlier this year, I attended the Regional Skills Competence Canada competition event in my hometown of Thunder Bay. And just last week, I was in Winnipeg for the national competition where over 500 youth from across Canada competed in 40 events. Investment in the Union Training and Innovation Program, in the Indigenous Job Training, and the expansion of student loans and grants program will help young Canadians pursue their studies in the skilled trades.
The Honourable Member for Mégantic-l'Érable. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In April, the Transport Minister announced 131 new rail safety projects and handed out over $20 million in subsidies. Unfortunately, the only rail safety project proposed by the community of Lac-Mégantic was summarily rejected by Transport Canada. This project would have trained first responders to intervene in a disaster based on the experience acquired during the terrible tragedy of July 6, 2013. The minister had a unique opportunity in his own department to walk the talk for the people of Lac-Mégantic. Why did he reject them? The Honourable Minister of Transport. Mr. Speaker, quite the contrary. We applaud the work done by the Institute. We are looking at this project with great interest because it's important that we be able to train first responders in a disaster situation. And Lac-Mégantic is making good proposals, and we are studying those. But I would like to take this opportunity to mention the 131 projects at Rail Crossing. We should applaud this initiative. $55 million. Thank you.
Columbia.
Mr. Speaker, the 2017-2018 Parks Canada Departmental Plan says they will address the Truth and Reconciliation Report's Call to Action number 79 by expanding the presentation and commemoration of Indigenous histories and cultures in Parks Canada's heritage places. But a recent Parks Canada RFP for exhibit writing does not require a focus on Indigenous history or require working with or even consulting with Indigenous groups. Will the minister withdraw the RFP and ensure that all future Parks Canada RFPs meet the spirit of the Reconciliation Report?
The Minister of Environment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member opposite for his advocacy on behalf of parks, but also with respect to Indigenous peoples. There's no more important relationship than our relationship with Indigenous peoples. We take very seriously our duty to accommodate and consult in accordance with our constitutional and international obligations. I will look into this matter, and I commit to get back to the member as soon as possible.
The Honourable Member for Vimy. Mr. Speaker, our government is working to diversify our trade exchanges to support the middle class, including by modernizing agreements that already exist. The Laval Working Group for the Status of Women works hard to promote gender equality. This week, the minister and her Chilean counterpart signed a modernized agreement introducing a chapter on trade and gender equality. Can the parliamentary secretary please inform the House of the importance of this chapter in the modernization of the Canada-Chile Free Trade Agreement? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Canada has made another major step forward. We are very proud of adding a chapter on trade and gender equality to our free trade agreement with Chile. It's a first in the G20. This chapter recognizes the importance of evaluating gender issues in trade so that we can ensure that everyone benefits from economic growth and ensure that women participate in the labor market. This is what progressive trade means for our government.
Yorkton Melville.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, over the last 9 months, Veterans Affairs Committee has heard gut-wrenching, heartbreaking testimony from many of our veterans who are suffering from the side effects of mefloquine. They've implored this government for medical help. Now that the Surgeon General has finally shared his report on mefloquine, it affirms the testimony of these veterans by finally relegating mefloquine as a drug of last resort for our troops. What remediation and assistance is this government going to provide to those who are required to take mefloquine and are now suffering the consequences?
Honourable Minister of Veterans Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, Veterans Affairs works hard each and every day to provide veterans and their families with the care and support they need when and where they need it. Regardless whether a veteran needs help from any time they have served, in our country, whether abroad, whether here at home, whether in service of any kind. Veterans Affairs, we are there to answer the phone, to be there to support and to help them. We encourage anyone who needs help to come forward, and we will be there to assist them through any process that they wish to go through with us.
The Honourable Member for Terrebonne. Mr. Speaker, with its new defense policy, the Defense Minister announced some good things, such as increasing the number of women and promoting diversity in the forces. What the Minister didn't do, however, was talk about French as a working language in the Canadian Armed Forces. Not a single word. You're a Francophone in the Navy? Well, speak English. In the Special Forces? Speak English. In the national courses, speak English. When will the Minister of the Defense and his department start to respect our Francophones and ensure that they can serve in French? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, I am very surprised by the question from the Honourable Member because in the riding of Saint-Jean alone, we announced the return of military training at the military college, and the funds have already been set out for that policy, and the announcement has already had an effect. Over 70 new candidates have applied for the courses because they know that there's going to be university training in both languages at the Saint-Jean Military College. The Honourable Member for Terrebonne. Well, that's great for training, but I'm talking about operational units. I saw it myself during my career. Ottawa isn't too concerned about French in the forces. We've heard that one many times. If you don't understand, ask a friend. French deserves to have a place in the forces. We get a new policy every 10 years. It's being updated, and there's still no progress. Not a single word about French in there. When will the government take its responsibility seriously and increase the number of units necessarily to ensure that our forces can serve in French? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, once again, in the armed forces and for our government, having forces who are bilingual is absolutely essential. And I think that we were able to see that during the flooding that we saw recently in Quebec, when all of the troops who were there, with one exception, were Francophones from Quebec who were able to help on the ground. And I can say that having Francophones on the ground was very reassuring for all the people of Quebec.